Welcome everyone to Liberaria Online, where I'm delighted to host Dennis McKenna and Michael Pollan. Michael's new book, This Is Your Mind on Plants, was published earlier in the month. Dennis has written a foreword to his late brother Terence's seminal classic, Food of the Gods. So the opportunity to get both gents in the same room, metaphorically, to discuss their research and experience is just too good to pass up. So I'm going to just briefly introduce the two gents, and then we'll open up the discussion. So Dennis is an ethnopharmacologist, research pharmacognosist, lecturer and author who has conducted field research in the Peruvian, Colombian and Brazilian Amazon. Dennis has co-authored several books on pharmacology and botany and has contributed to forward to his late brother's classic, which I've just mentioned. Michael is an author and journalist who is currently Knight Professor of Science and Journalism at UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. He is best known for his work exploring botany, culture and human consciousness. This Is Your Mind on Plants focuses on specific medicines, sedatives, stimulants and psychedelics, and our cultural and evolutionary codependence echoes an earlier book by Michael titled The Botany of Desire, which is one of my all-time favorites of non-fiction. And so I guess the opening question, Michael, was this a natural progression in your curiosity and writing? And how did you arrive at exploring these specific psychoactive medicines?
Yeah, thank you, Lloyd. Thanks for your question, and thanks to Dennis for being here with us. Dennis is one of my intellectual heroes and somebody I've learned a lot from over the years. And thanks to the whole Second Home community. I wish I could be there in person with you. It's such a special place. So I have always been interested in the human engagement with plants and how they change us and we change them. And I mean, going back to my time as a gardener, you know, it really grew out of my time in the garden. And in Botany of Desire, I did look at this symbiosis. And I have been, you know, all my work has really been about this relationship. And if that's at the center of the work, there are a couple big branches that come off of that trunk. One is food and agriculture. And of course, I wrote several books about that. That's perhaps the most important thing we use plants for. And our engagement with them to produce food changes the world more than anything else we do. Changes the composition of species, the landscape, and now we know the atmosphere. Because food is a giant contributor to climate change. But then there's always been in the back of my head, and it pops up from time to time, as in Botany of Desire, this interest in this very curious thing plants do for us, which is to change our consciousness. That's really weird. And it's a little weird that turns out to be a universal desire. To change the textures of consciousness and sometimes change consciousness in more radical ways. And I've been curious as to why plants produce compounds that do that, why we like them, why drug taking hasn't been, which involves obvious risks, right? Of not just overdose, because a lot of these drugs are toxic at some doses, but also risk of accident, risk of, you know, being preyed on. It makes you discombobulates you in ways that you would think natural selection would do away with. So this human desire, what is it good for? What have drugs given us? And this is, I know, something Dennis knows a whole lot about. And that is, you know, I really wanted to explore that. I started on it in Botany of Desire, but there was so much more to be said. And so that's what brought me to this book, to take a deep dive into 3 plant-based chemicals, and see if we can't learn something about us. Because I see these relationships as mirrors that teach us not just about the plant world, but about our world, our minds, our desires, what makes us tick, which finally is, you know, what we're all interested in discovering.
And how about yourself, Dennis? You've been in this field for, well, a lifetime. So how did you arrive at studying something like psychoactive plants and our relationship to culture?
Well, thank you. Yes, I have been around in this space longer than I care to think about. You know, I mean, I grew up, I was a child of the 60s. I was born in 1950. So the 60s were my teenage years, particularly toward the end of that. It was a time of turmoil, you know, political and social. And my brother was out in California, and he's 4 years older, or he was 4 years older than me, and led me into a lot of areas where I probably, you know, was not ready to go. But anyway, we shared this curiosity about altered states. We were actually, both of us were, you know, we were interested in shamanism and Jungian psychology and alchemy and all of these things. But I do have to say that science fiction was probably an outsized influencer on both of us, you know, and science fiction, for those of you that know it, can be a mind stretcher, you know, and it's a place where radical wild ideas can come forth. And I think one of the things that appealed to Terence and me, you know, at that time in the late 60s was this idea, and we were just discovering psychedelics, and there wasn't much to discover. There was LSD, occasionally mescaline. My brother was very good at working the matrix, so he had DMT, which was very rare in those days. But DMT became the focus of our interest and kind of the driver of our curiosity, because again, with this idea of, you know, a sort of science fiction perspective, you know, we thought it was like another dimension, and maybe it is another dimension, and maybe these substances can get you there. That was kind of the operating, you know, that's what drove the curiosity. And I don't think that question is completely resolved, but I got into it essentially out of curiosity. I mean, Terence and I were always interested in weird stuff, you know, and I have to credit my dad to a certain degree, because he was very invested in being an ordinary person. It was like a post-war mindset. He just wanted to come home from the war and live a normal life, but he wasn't a normal person. He was too smart. He was interested in too much, and he is the one that introduced us to science fiction and Fate magazine. He traveled for a living. He'd come back on weekends and bring these copies of Fate magazine, which was all about the paranormal and, you know, yetis and you know, UFOs and all of this stuff, and occasionally drugs. They had interesting articles about like the Peruvian dream beverage, and, you know, in the land of mescaline, and they had these kinds of things. So that was a part of our background, and then it was just curiosity that drove us. And, you know, Terence and I have this sort of legend, but I didn't become a serious scientist about it until I started graduate school in 1980 at the University of British Columbia, and you know, determined to investigate ayahuasca. I had worked on mushrooms before. Terry and I published a book called the Psilocybin Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, which started out as a hobby. You know, we figured out how to grow these critters. Then we published a little pamphlet, actually, that became very influential in the society. So lots of people learned their methods from that and got their first mushroom experiences from that. So I don't want to go on too long, but that's kind of what got me started.
That's a great kind of intro into how you guys got into the field. I guess the kind of burning question is that our recent knowledge of psychedelic, psychoactive plants is quite recent, but the human relationship is more kind of archaic. It goes back millennia. How did we as a species discover these? I know, Michael, you talk about caffeine being discovered by like a goat herder observing his livestock just going wild on berries. But how do we go back further? How do you discover this?
Yeah,
story?
well, I'm going to defer to Dennis on this one because he knows his ethnobotany better than I do. But one of the reasons in this new book I wanted to look at mescaline was because it may be the oldest psychedelic that we know of, that we have an archaeological record for it. There's evidence of human use in Texas and Mexico 6,000 years ago, which is kind of incredible. And that's a signal that, you know, these native peoples have a deeper familiarity than we do with psychedelic substances and may have something to teach us about their use. What's interesting about caffeine is it's so recent, so it has a recorded history. Whether the goat herder story is true or not, it may be a legend, but it, you know, I mean, we learn a lot by observing the behavior of animals, and the idea is that this guy, he was in, I think, Ethiopia, and his goats, when they chewed on the berries on a particular shrub, the red berries, they would get frisky and stay up all night. And then he supposedly brought these berries to a monk who turned them into a beverage. But it's fairly recent history compared to the opiates or cannabis or mescaline or alcohol. And that's one of the reasons I was so interested in caffeine, because you can look at the before and after. Europe before caffeine and Europe after caffeine. And so that's why it's such a great case study for how a plant chemical influences our development as people. I mean, in that case, not evolution so much, but the rise of capitalism and the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason. We can really see the impact. But as for the ancient shamanic use, how did people discover that? I don't know, Dennis, what would you say?
Well, I think in part it's trial and error. You know, I think that people are inherently curious, and you know what I love about Michael's perspective and my perspective about all this is that we're totally in sync. Usually, when we talk about psychedelics, you know, the focus is on the cultural context and, you know, the historical context and all that. But there's a wider perspective, which Michael and I share, which is that this is a coevolutionary process. And he's talked so well and elegantly in so many places about the fact that these alliances with plants, whether we use them for food or medicine or other purposes, this is symbiosis. You know, this is a alliance between different species for mutual benefits. So that's really what symbiosis is. And I think what you're looking at here is a coevolutionary phenomenon, which is why you know, it's plausible, not necessarily, certainly not proven, but it's not completely crazy to suggest that, for example, evolving hominids in Northern Africa 2 million years ago were eating mushrooms. You know, they probably were, because we know enough about that environment at that time to infer reasonably. I mean, we know it was much wetter. You know, there were seasonal rainfalls. We know that there were cattle in the area, which is, you know, the dung of which the mushrooms grow on. And we know that there were hominids in the area. So you can put those things together and speculate, you know, that probably people, you know, those evolving hominids were consuming mushrooms, and what effect might that have had, you know, on the emergence of consciousness, the emergence of language and the imagination and all that. Again, I tend to digress. I don't want to, but a point I want to make is that plants mediate, a famous botanist once said, plants substitute biosynthesis for behavior. You know, animals react to their environment through behavior. They can run away, they can stay and fight. Plants are stuck in one place. So they mediate their environment, they mediate their relationships with their environment through chemistry, at which they are very good because they've mastered photosynthesis, so they can make all these secondary compounds that mediate their environment with everything. Other plants, insects, fungi, and bacteria in the soil, mammals that might want to nibble on them, like us, and that's how they optimize their relationships with, with other organisms in their environment. It's all the language of plants is chemistry, essentially, and some of the secondary compounds that plants have happened to evolve over millions and millions of years happen to resemble neurotransmitters, and they hit those neural networks in the human brain, and we find they have interesting effects. This is not an accident. These chemicals all evolved out of the same evolutionary mix. Serotonin, for example, we think of serotonin as a neurotransmitter, in mammals, in the mammalian brain, and so on. But serotonin is all over in nature. Many plants contain serotonin, so these secondary compounds become purpose to whatever symbiotic relationships may be convenient. And the plant's agenda and the fungi agenda, I think, is pretty simple. They just want to grow and spread, and so whatever facilitates that for them through these chemically mediated symbiotic alliances is good for the plant.
So something that I want to follow up on there that's really interesting. I mean, yes, it is. I mean, I just want to underline this. How remarkable that a plant could come up with develop a chemical that fits precisely. There's the precise key to fit in a human brain and make something happen. But a lot of these chemicals begin with another purpose,
Yes.
which is to say they're defense chemicals. And why do you think it's true that a plant trying to defend itself chemically would create a chemical that does a lot more than just kill a pest?
Because it's more complicated than just defense. Some of these chemicals are defense chemicals, for sure, and others, and that's that's one of their purposes. Some of them are signaling chemicals. They send a message. These things are chemical messengers, in consistent with the idea that plants are, that this is a language for plant. This is how they mediate their relationships with things in the environment. So, and it also depends on what context. A chemical that might be a repellent or a toxin in certain situations, for example, beta carbolines from ayahuasca are a good example. I mean, in some situations they're antiviral, they're antimicrobial, they interact with their environment on that way. But in other cases, it's their neuropharmacology that becomes more important because they're MAO inhibitors and they potentiate tryptamine. So there are basically three functions: protection, the repellent function, the signaling function. And it's interesting when the signal is, the repellent message is go away, leave me alone. I don't want to be molested and you'll regret it if you do. But it gets more interesting when the signal is come closer.
Yeah.
Let's do stuff together. Let's form symbiosis together and see what comes out of that. So symbiosis is also mediated by these plant chemical messengers. And it's an important point that you make, Michael, which is psilocybin or other, these things were around in the environment. Plants were making them millions of years before there were humans or anything resembling complex nervous systems, but they became adapted as complex nervous systems evolved. These chemicals were already there, and in some ways were the precursors of them. For example, psilocybin is a good example. Mushrooms, basidiomycetes, showed up about 75 million years ago. long before there were any primates to appreciate psilocybin, and psilocybin was there, and it had multiple functions. It still does. Recent work on the horizontal gene transfer of psilocybin biosynthesis complex indicates that it was important for the mushrooms long before there were humans. It wasn't evolved for us, but in the fullness of evolutionary time, we started interacting with these fungi, consuming them, and those that had this chemical in it may have had an evolutionary advantage in the sense that they made us, they gave us a motivation to collect them, spread them, preserve them, and so on. So
some of them,
yeah.
One of the things that's really interesting too is that in some cases the plant itself can repurpose a chemical. So
yes.
Caffeine is a defense chemical, right? It repels insects. It also appears to make it hard for other plants to grow nearby. The leaves fall on the ground and essentially poison it for other plants.
Mm-hmm.
But then we recently learned that some classes of plant make caffeine, this supposed pesticide, in their nectar. And they're using it to attract bees. And honeybees share our love of caffeine, as it turns out. They're getting a tiny dose, not enough to harm them, but enough apparently, and this is recent research that was done in England, to help the bee remember where it got that buzz. I mean, we don't actually know if they have any phenomenology, but about this. And remember where it was and return to those flowers preferentially because of that reward. So there is a plant that is just taking the exact same molecule and using it for two diametrically opposed purposes. And that's quite remarkable.
Right, and not uncommon. I mean, plant caffeine is a great example. As you say, it's a good insecticide, and it's a central nervous system stimulant, and it's a plant growth inhibitor. It's all of these things. So these chemicals that plants are so good at spinning out, these so-called secondary compounds, have generally multiple purposes in the ecosystem. They have an effect on the ecosystem, and we're part of that ecosystem. I mean, it's interesting. For example, with psilocybin, I've thought you could think of psilocybin in a sense as a kind of a neuro-eco hormone. In the fungal world, there's a group of fungi in the ascomycetes, closely related to mushrooms, but not a different phylum slightly, or a different, I'm not sure what the term is, but phylogenetically a little different. But the cordyceps mushrooms, which have evolved extremely complex symbioses with insects, where the fungus actually grows into the brains of
Is that
insects.
Symbiosis though? Since the
well, yeah, it is a kind of symbiosis. I mean, it's a parasitism.
That gets screwed completely.
Yeah, it's a parasitism, but that's a symbiosis. There are various kinds of symbiosis. This is not much benefit for the insect. In this case, the mushroom or the cordyceps fungus is taking over the behavior of the insect and directing it to act in ways that optimize spore dispersal. It will essentially infect the ant or the caterpillar, whatever, and it will direct its behavior to climb up a blade of grass to optimize its position for spore dispersal. Then it will kill it, and it will be paralyzed, clinging to this blade of grass, and then the cordyceps will sporulate. It'll form the
after
sporangia,
bursting out of its head.
And it comes bursting out of its head, right? So in this case, it's enslaved the insect, and I'm thinking psilocybin may have a similar effect. I mean, it doesn't have to physically infect us, but it produces this molecule, which we find delightful and interesting. So we have a motive to consume that molecule and to make sure that there are mushrooms around. So
and to spreading it inadvertently. I remember when
I was spreading it. Yeah. So it doesn't have to go so far as to actually physically infect it. We just happen to appreciate, its chemical creativity, I guess you could say.
I remember going mushroom hunting for psilocybes with our mutual friend Paul Stamets in, well, I can't say where, but we were looking for psilocybe azurescens, which is a rare and very potent variety of psilocybin, and we went to this campground, and we noticed that most of them were growing very close to the parking lot. And he said at some point, one of the indicator species for psilocybe azurescens is the Winnebago, the trailer. Right. And so people were gathering them and carrying them back to the trailer. And of course, whenever you gather mushrooms, you're spreading spores without knowing it. And
exactly.
So we see that. We see what the mushroom gained from that relationship.
And the mushrooms do often show up. They become associated with human settlements, and human disturbance of the landscape and so on. Particularly like that's the association with pastoral communities, as these pastoral cultures move out of their area of origin into new regions, they take their cattle with them and they take their mushrooms with them. The mushrooms kind of tag along to this human cattle alliance that's going on. So, you can go into pretty much any pasture in a tropical area where there's rainfall and there are cattle, you're going to find mushrooms. You're going to find Psilocybe cubensis. It's a pan-tropical mushroom, very common in that kind of environment, which is not unlike the environment that you'd have in Northern Africa 2 million years ago. You can find essentially the
I want to go back to this question that Lloyd asked at the beginning about traditional cultures. One of the reasons I wanted to write about mescaline is in How to Change Your Mind, I really looked at the science of psychedelics, and it was in large part because it's a very fringe subject then, more fringe than it is now. And I knew science. What?
Thanks to you, largely.
Well,
thank you.
Maybe it helped a little bit in legitimizing it, but I knew that science was the way you could persuade people to take it seriously, and wouldn't be talking about shamanism or anything else. So, but I kept learning when I was studying this that, in fact, the foundation of psychedelic medicine that we think is this new science is ancient, right? And that we are drawing on shamanic practices. Our doctors are when they're prescribing these drugs and setting people's expectations. And it's indigenous knowledge that's behind a lot of the field. So in this book, I really wanted to look at that and see what we might have to learn from the indigenous use of psychedelics. And because my premise is that the Western use of psychedelics, when they showed up in the 50s and 60s, we didn't really know what they were. We didn't really have a very good understanding, and we didn't know how best to use them. And we did some really crazy, stupid things. You would put LSD in the punch bowl. Not you, but maybe you, but people would. And
no, I never did that, but I know what you mean. We did not know how to use these things. And
they came without an instruction manual. And,
right.
And we, of course, there were people who could have taught us, but we didn't respect them enough. There was a couple exceptions. Andy Weil, for example, had spent all this time in South America, and he knew a lot about indigenous use. And he wrote about it in The Natural Mind, which is a wonderful book, a book he wrote in like 3 weeks when he was 28 years old. I highly recommend it. And his premise, and I think it tests out, is that these groups can teach us how to use these drugs better than we have been. And there are a few basic principles underlying indigenous use. There's usually an elder involved, a shaman or a medicine carrier. There's they're not taken casually. There's always a kind of sense of occasion, intention. They're usually done in a group setting, which is interesting too. And they're always surrounded by ritual. And I think these principles have a lot to teach us. And that's why I wanted to look at the Native American church and also the Wachuma ceremonies of Peru. in this book. But you've spent a lot of time with Indigenous peoples and looking at their use. Are there other things that we have to learn?
Well, yeah, I think there's always more to learn, but the point you make is very important, which is that this is a group of medicines that requires a vessel, and was sometimes called the set and the setting. These are very important, and whatever the set and the setting is, it's important that there be one, a ritual structure. It may be traditional, it may be some kind of neo-shamanic modern adaptation of traditional practices, or it may be something else. But the important thing is that there is a vessel, there's a structure for this to happen.
Container.
Yeah. These are not medicines, hopefully they never will be, where the instruction is take 2 and call me in the morning.
Yeah. Or take one every day for the rest of your life.
Yeah, or take and don't bother to call me at all.
Yeah.
This requires the active participation of the person that's having the experience, or persons, the elder or the maestro, the curandero that's orchestrating it, or the therapist, and the environment. It has to be appropriate, and the set and setting. The setting has got to be appropriate, and then the set is really your mindset that comes to it, and the benefits of the experience will be directly proportional to how thoughtfully you approach it, how informed you are about it. So there's preparation, and then there's the experience, and then there's integration. And in those 3 phases, you get the most out of it, and you get the therapeutic benefits that you get. Not that recreational use can't be, recreational and fun, not necessarily harmful. Often you can learn from that. But ideally, if you're doing serious psychedelic work, you need those elements of a well-structured set and setting and intention and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And I know lots of people who had, wonderful experiences, and their set and setting was a Grateful Dead concert or a music festival. And that use for many people has been, profound and very useful. But I think that by approaching it the way we're describing, you can minimize the kind of adverse events that did happen, that people did get in trouble and had, sometimes terrifying experiences. And one of the things that's telling about this research agenda is that the number of adverse events has been very low, if any, and that even bad trips become very therapeutic when someone is with you to help you process them. So and also we're talking, I think, about a high dose. I think that there are doses where the more casual use is not going to be a problem.
Yeah, and that's right. There's got to be, and your point about bad trips is, is well taken. There is no such thing as a bad trip. There could be I guess a bad trip would be one you don't survive. But that's pretty rare. Anything short of that, even though these trips can be very challenging, they're learning opportunities. They're challenging for a reason. So again, this is where your preparation, your expectation, your advanced knowledge of what may happen, all that is useful, will be useful to help optimize the trip.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that whatever comes up is the product of your mind. It's not the molecule, right? The molecule is a catalyst.
Right.
Whatever you experience, this imagery or childhood trauma or whatever negative things come up, you're learning something about yourself. These are holding a mirror up to you. And sometimes what you see in that mirror is terrifying.
But that's the point. I mean, not that it's terrifying, but that it really does hold a mirror. I mean, here's the big difference between, psychopharmaceuticals like SSRIs, for example. They don't really get at the root of your problems. They are Band-Aids. They kind of, paper it over. psychedelics with the right kind of set and setting, follow-up, integration and all that can actually help you get at the root of your depression, your trauma, your addiction, or whatever your issues are, and actually cure it, and actually resolve the problem, which is one reason why I'm puzzled about all the excitement about psychedelics in the pharma industry. A lot of these companies are jumping on board, but do they pause to think that ideally when these things are used properly and people realize the benefits from them, a person might take them maybe 2 or 3 times in a lifetime. These are not things that you take every day for the rest of your life, unless you're,
and that's a tremendous challenge. And nobody has figured out a business model to profit from psychedelics. And I frankly hope they don't. But they're certainly trying, and they're trying to patent them, which is also an issue since they continue to grow in nature and can't be stopped. But yeah, I agree. It's going to be hard to fit into the pharmaceutical structure we have, since the industry is based on chronic diseases and taking a pill you need every day. And this is a very short-term intervention. You're going to sell somebody 2 or 3 pills over the course of their lives. So how much can you charge for them? Well, you can charge for the therapy, and there is a lot of therapeutic support that's required. Yes. And that's a challenge to the talking therapy industry, which they're also based on the weekly visit that goes on and on and on and on. And this is going to be this intense period of, 20 hours, virtually all at once, and then nothing. So it's going to be interesting to watch how people try to monetize this. And it's not at all clear, even though already lots of money is being made, but it's mostly the money that comes from, initial stock offerings.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So it is going to be a challenge for these companies to adapt to this. And again, in this context, if we want to look at the way that Indigenous people use these substances and integrate them into their lives, what I would like to see happen in North America is what already exists in South America and other places where these things are used. I mean, there are lots of negative aspects about ayahuasca tourism and all that, and that's kind of another conversation. But the point is that in these indigenous cultures, especially the ones that are not yet so impacted by Western culture, Western economies, Western values, the practitioner, the shaman, the curandero is just some ordinary person, who happens to have knowledge of these medicines and as a resource for their community. I would like to see, rather than clinics, I'd rather see healing centers or something similar to what you find in South America exist in North America. Like every community could have a community center where, among other types of holistic health offerings, maybe dietary counseling, yoga, massage, all that stuff, psychedelics are just one of the things on the menu. And people can come there and bring the kids, spend the weekend, and they'll look like spas, not like clinics. They'll be healing centers. You get your
body wrap and your massage and your psychedelic journey.
You got it. Yeah.
But how are we going to make that accessible to people? Because that's going to be expensive. Spas are expensive.
But but they can be reasonable. There will be expense, not as expensive as paying $30,000 for a clinical study with psilocybin. The cost differential will be somewhat less. But yes, that's another thing. We need to try to keep the costs down. We need to address this issue. There's a certain faction of people that are involved in this that said, well, these are only safe in the hands of clinicians, so they want to co-opt it, and that creates a dichotomy. It's like the only safe psilocybin is synthetic psilocybin, for example. I don't agree with that. I think that people should have the right, if they want to go into the woods and pick mushrooms, this should not be prohibited. You know, I mean, it comes down to this fundamental fact that these are symbiotic relationships. And I think one of the things that we need to start articulating is that we have a right to symbiosis with any organism in the environment, as long as we use it responsibly, you know, and
I agree with you. I completely agree with you. And
yeah.
I think if we only medicalized psychedelics, they have a lot of value for people who are not clinically diagnosed with a mental illness.
Yes.
But I think that the world that exists now, which is to say, you know, actual mushrooms grown by individuals who are guides and treating people underground, is not going to go away. In fact,
No.
The more medical research there is, the more popularity that route is. The value of the medical path is that it could lead to coverage by national health or by insurance, and that is how you make it accessible. So I don't think I wouldn't dismiss that path, but it just shouldn't be the only path. And there's a third path too, which is opening up, which is the religious path. You know, we already have three in America. We've got these three churches, two ayahuasca churches, one the Native American church, which uses peyote. And there are a whole lot of new churches forming. And I think some of them are going to be made legal. I think it'll be possible to go to a church and have your psilocybin experience in that context. And that's very exciting also. Lloyd, I wonder if we shouldn't take some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. You're welcome. I'm speaking to the audience to type your questions in the chat, but if you're feeling bold, unmute yourself and get asking.
I just had a quick question. If the gentleman thought that maybe with the big push in the UFO community, where we're acknowledging these craft, do they think that in any way we can use this plant medicine to maybe communicate with either other dimensional beings or extraterrestrials? And I'll mute myself to shut up.
Well, I don't know.
Yes, I brother.
Right. I thought you might. Honestly, Scott, I think the jury's out. You know, I mean, one assumption about, you know, there are two views of the experiences that you have with psychedelics. And one is that these come out of your head. These are experiences that your brain gins up and you have them, and they don't really have, they don't come from outside. But then many people on psychedelics, especially mushrooms or ayahuasca, have the sense of being in communication with intelligences, and you know, whether extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional, it's hard to say. It's very hard to, how would you test that? What would you do to verify that? That's the tricky part. Or is it a part of yourself that is presenting as something that's not yourself? You know, and or is it some combination? I mean, you know, the other question here is, you know, we don't know what the boundaries of consciousness are. I was just reading an article a day or so ago about panpsychism, you know, and the idea that consciousness exists at every level of organization, from you know, the quantum to the cosmic, that intelligence and consciousness of a form is just a fundamental property of reality, you know. And when you see, and it tends to emerge in these complex systems, that with the degree of complexity seems to be related to the element of the, you know, the quality of consciousness, but it's there at the most fundamental levels, but then we experience. So that's a long-winded way of saying I don't know the answer, Scott.
Yeah, and I don't either. I think it's very interesting that a common result of psychedelic experience is questioning the simple physicalist explanation of consciousness as a product of brains. And there is this sense you often have that consciousness exists outside of you as well. And it opens your mind to that. It's not proof of that, but it certainly makes you more open to considering the possibility of things you would have considered just kind of weird and crazy otherwise.
Yeah, yeah.
So I've got two questions. I've also got Matt Medina, whose hand's raised. If you wish to unmute yourself, Matt, feel free to ask.
Sure thing, thank you. So yeah, this is really for either of you, but I'm wondering for education to get into this field, you know, there's so many avenues, but I guess if we're getting into the ethnobotany, and if we could stick to that, you know, what would you recommend for, you know, course materials and what schools, you know, what programs are more, more holistic in their teaching, like they incorporate a wide variety of, you know, like they don't just shun indigenous teachings, and it's not strictly Western science, not strictly one or the other.
Right, right. Well, unfortunately, I wish I could say that there were programs in ethnobotany or ethnopharmacology all over the place. As a matter of fact, they're extremely rare. You know, I mean, there should be whole departments devoted to this, and actually they're not. They've been kind of marginalized, and there are a few places. For example, I think it's a guy named Michael Heinrich. I think he is at King's College London. He has a pretty active program in ethnopharmacology. You know, there are university programs out there. You know, one thing perhaps worth mentioning here, you have to connect with the community of interest, and one organization that I always recommend to people: join the Society for Economic Botany. That is the closest you can come to an organization in which ethnobotany figures really high. And through that, I mean, there's special rates for students and so on. Join the Society for Economic Botany, and it'll give you an idea what the state of the art is in terms of academic programs. That's a good way to begin to connect. I do want to mention, since you raised it, here's a chance to plug the McKenna Academy, but we're planning to offer a course in ethnobotany beginning in September in collaboration with the Organization for Tropical Studies, which is based in Costa Rica. So you can find more out about that if you go to the McKenna Academy, but we're going to create that ethnobotany course, and that will be virtual and online and so on.
Wonderful. Will there be scholarships for that program?
We're looking for people to fund scholarships, yes. If you know any wealthy people that would like to help pay poor, starving students, we'd like to hear from them. Yeah, we'd like to be able to offer some scholarships for sure.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Sure.
So the next question's from Stephanie Morgan, because you got first in the chat. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Hi, thank you so much for being here and doing this. I have a lot of respect for you both. And my question is maybe kind of simple, which is just, how is something like LSD, which is synthesized, right?
Mm-hmm.
How is that different than any other drug in the pharmaceutical world? You know, we have mushrooms that grow in the ground, and then and other plant medicines, and then we have things that are made in a lab. And it's hard for me to make that jump to see those as sort of equal, since we've sort of mucked with to get there.
Even though LSD is synthesized, it's based on, it's derived from a molecule produced by a fungus, the ergot fungus, right, which grows on grain. So even, you know, some of the drugs we think of as synthetic are still modeled on plant chemicals or fungal chemicals. There's a tendency to romanticize, I think, drugs that come from plants rather than from laboratories, but there are a lot of valuable drugs produced in laboratories. We're not as good as the plants in general. I mean, they're much more original. But like if you take the example of Sasha Shulgin, who was the great psychedelic chemist in the 70s and 80s, and he invented lots of new synthetic psychedelics. He started by tweaking the mescaline molecule and, adding this, taking this out. So I don't think there's a hard and fast rule about what you're describing. Sometimes chemicals in there, psychoactives in their plant form are safer and milder, like coca leaves compared to cocaine. But in other times, the natural form might have lots of other alkaloids that make you sick. So Dennis, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. There's nothing inherently superior about natural drugs. I mean, traditionally in science, this is what medicinal chemistry has often been about, not just for psychedelics, but they often start with a natural molecular compound, a natural structure, and then they tweak it, to make it, give it better pharmacokinetics or more selective for whatever its target is, or often just to make it sure it's patentable, because natural products are harder to patent. But synthetics are fine. I mean, and the work that Shulgin did proves this. I mean, the compounds that he related to, I mean, they were, he used to talk about their little drug souls, to him, these compounds carried their own mystery, and it's a tribute to, people's creativity that they can take these natural products and modify them. And, I like to remind people that all drugs are natural because they either come from plants or fungi, or they're made by all natural organic chemists, who are part of nature as well, So I don't see anything inherently, better about synthetics than, or about plants and fungi, other than one of the factors might be that you can be more sure what you're getting if you go with a natural drugs, something like MDMA out on the street. It could be any damn thing, and there's really no way to tell unless you submit it to a lab for analysis. So just, it's inherently, but it's hard to fake mushrooms or, ayahuasca. These are, you can be confident that it is what it represents itself to be.
Gotcha. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So the next question I've got is from Maria Estevez. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask away.
Hi, hello everybody. Greetings from Spain. Thank you very much for being here. This is really, really interesting. And I wanted to ask a question related to LSD. I recently learned that there is a substance that is called LSA, and that is very similar to LSD, and that it can be extracted from plants or flowers like the morning glory and similar flowers. I don't remember.